Dr. Arianna, thank you so much for joining us. You may begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Ahmed, for this invitation. And let's start. I will share with you my screen. Just a second. Now you should see. It's okay?
I can see it, yes.
Okay. So the topic of this talk today is مخطوطات قبة الخزنة بالجامع الأموي. And I'm telling you something about the corpus of unwritten material stored in the Qubbat al-Khaznah in the Umayyad Great Mosque. This is a corpus of manuscripts and documents that is still far to be known in its entirety. And the same can be said for the history of the Qubba. Once Qubbat al-Mal, when it was still storing the treasure of the mosque, and especially its transition from a treasury to storeroom for worn-out manuscripts, books in many different languages and scripts, as well as its openings at various epochs and by different authorities. Starting from Al-Istahri, 4th, 10th century, and for arriving to Ibn Battuta, 7th, 14th century, there are a number of Arabic sources attesting the use of the Qubba as a repository for the funds of the mosque, but none relates about the change of its intended use. And yet, today, we speak about the Qubba as a repository of manuscripts and documents. So it is worth recalling what kind of unwritten material was stored in the Qubba, since it encompasses documents, literary and religious texts, certificate of pilgrimage to Mecca, Quranic fragments, Arabic and Turkish literary text, parchment fragments in Latin language and script, but also fragments in Greek script, fragments in Old French, in Hebrew, in Armenian, in Coptic, in Syriac, in Aramaic, and in Greek script, but Arabic language. This is the famous violet fragment we will speak about later. All these manuscripts date back to a period ranging from the late antiquity to modern times. The most recent written evidence found in the Qubba is a fragment of the New Testament in Arabic, printed in London in 1830. Considering all this variety, the manuscript material of the Qubbat al-Khazna in Damascus still stands nowadays as one of the most significant, albeit little known and poorly researched manuscript discoveries. In this respect, the publication of a volume edited by Ronnie Folland, Konrad Hirscher, and myself, devoted to the Qubba's history and multilingual materials, aimed at making a first step in the path of a better knowledge of this group of documents and manuscript fragments. The contributions of international scholars gathered in these volumes, that is the output of a workshop that took place in Berlin in 2018, aims at shedding light on various aspects of the Qubba history and holdings. A history that starts in Damascus, in the courtyard of the Great Mosque, of course, and that involves different people from both East and West, and touches different places, namely Berlin and Istanbul, besides Damascus. The Qubba material is actually currently scattered among a number of institutions in and outside Syria. Today, I'm going to show you some of the materials once stored in the Qubba, and I will briefly refer to its history. Despite the fact that the Qubba was a somehow living organism within the wall of the Umayyad Mosque for a very long span of time, a memorable moment in its long history is connected with the arrival of the German Bruno Violet in Damascus in 1900. This German-Turkish connection, because Bruno Violet was helped by Turkish authorities to go to Damascus and open the Qubbat, helps to understand the transfer in 1917 of thousands of manuscripts to Istanbul. The figure of 211,603 items that identifies the group known as Damascus papers, yet useful, does not give the exact amount of the material, since documents and scroll were not included in this count, having separate inventory numbers. In Istanbul, the contents of the Qubbat went first to the Archaeological Museum, and then they were moved to the library of the Topkapi Palace Museum. Part of the fragments remained there, and some others were instead moved to the newly created Museum of Islamic Endowments, that later became the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art. However, as Konrad Ischler stresses, already in 1878, almost complete books coming from the Qubbat, so not fragments, but almost real books, were transferred within Damascus from the mosque to the then new public library. So here you see just the interior of the new Museum of the Turkish and Islamic Art, and you can see also a sort of box for Quran in the shape of a Qubbat. But let's have a closer look now to the manuscript we are talking about. One of the stars fragment for Arabics is the so-called Violet fragment. A fragment with two columns of scripts, both in Greek characters, but one in Greek language and the other in Arabic language. The Violet fragment is an allographic text, we can say, as far as Arabic is concerned, containing Psalm 77 or 78, according to the version of the Bible you are following. The current whereabouts of the volume we are seeing now are unknown. We don't know where it is. The importance of the Violet fragment has been studied in depth by various scholars, notably its phonetic transcription system of the Arabic in Greek and its linguistic features. Maria Mavrudi stressed the fact that the fragment and its system of transcription were not created for practical purposes, such as an ignorance of the Greek or the Arabic languages. Rather, this fragment testifies to the strong link to Greek as a Christian language, and it represents an ideological outcome rather than a practical product. Besides the Violet fragment, I will not go too much in detail about each slide, just to give you an idea of the material we are dealing with. So besides this fragment, we have other biblical fragments in Greek script, in Onchal script in Greek, that are palimpsest. And in this case, we can see a number of fragments with Greek as a scripture inferior and Arabic as a scripture superior. One of the folios pertaining to the same manuscript was first published by Hananu in 1964 in the Journal of the Arabic Academy of Sciences, Majallat Ma'had al-Ilmi al-Arabi. The scripture inferior of this fragment, as I said, is Greek, and its scripture superior contains portions of the text of the Arabic version of the Exodus. So it's an early Arabic translation of the Bible, of the biblical book of the Exodus, Kitab al-Khuruj. I can now add other fragments, these fragments, to the one published by Hananu from the same codex, and this picture are among those taken by Bruno Violet. I already had occasion to study the fragments illustrated by Anano, which is possible to date as the fragments we see now to the end of the 8th or the beginning of the 9th century, and that is possible to be localized into southern Palestine on paleographical grounds. In the group of palimpsests with Greek as scriptio inferior and Arabic as scriptio superior, I like to mention also this fragment recently studied by one of my pupils, Matteo Pimpinelli, who was able to identify the Arabic text as the botanical medical text by the Andalusian jurist Ibn Habib, living active between the at the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd century, Hijri, 8th, 9th century. And the text is the Mukhtasar Fittib, and this is not the only medical text found in the Qubbat find. We have also other medical texts, not just in Arabic, but in other languages, like this one in Syriac, in the group actually of Syriac manuscripts, besides some Peshitta fragment and a commentary on the Ecclesiastes by Theodore of Mopsuestia. There is and a section as well of the catechetical homilies by the same author, both of which texts were otherwise unknown. There is a medical fragment of 4 leaves in Certo, tentatively dated to the 9th century. And this was recently identified by Emiliano Fiori. Much other palimpsest material remain, the reading of which is rendered difficult by the Arabic scriptio superior. But though this, but still, despite the fact that it's unpublished, already in 2009, Sebastian Brock has been able to identify the general topic and in some cases the contents of all the Syriac fragments coming from the Qubbat. There is also, coming from the Qubbat, an impressive number of Armenian manuscripts, the most ancient specimens dating back to the 10th century. And it is possible to enumerate here some biblical fragments, liturgical books, patristic texts, hagiographies, literary texts, as well as writing exercises. These latter, the writing exercises, are very useful for understanding the degree of alphabetization of the people at that time, attested during all the Middle Ages until the beginning of the modern era. These manuscripts are strictly connected with the presence of the Christian Armenian community, which was and remains the largest in Damascus. Besides Armenian fragments, there are also Georgian manuscripts and some Coptic fragments, Awraq bil-Qubtiyya. And in this case, the Coptic fragment testifies the relation between Damascus and Egypt during the Islamic era. The Coptic fragments are very significant because they are rare examples of Coptic manuscripts discovered outside of Egypt, documenting the presence of Coptic communities abroad. In particular, Alin Sucho of Göttingen Academy has been able to identify a Boairic fragment which contains the Acts of Matthew in the city of Kainat, and this is a fragment that represents the first attestation of this apocryphal text in Coptic. There are also, coming from the Qubbat, Hebrew manuscript, like the one we see now, and Hebrew manuscript represents another component of the find, consists mainly of sacred texts, Old Testament, liturgical, and synagogal text, but they also include Jewish marriage contracts and a Samaritan calendar too. Last but not least, I must mention also the nucleus of 21 Aramaic Christian fragments of sacred text, almost all of which palimpsest, datable between the 9th and the 13th century. There is also, of course, some fragments in Latin script and Latin language, as well as I mentioned at the beginning, in Old French. As I said, the fragments and the volumes linked to the Qubbat are currently scattered in different institutions in Damascus and abroad. I would like to focus the attention now on the material in Damascus. This was in 2006, now a number of years ago, during my stay in Damascus, when I was able to gain access to the collection of the National Museum. Actually, the Syrian National Museum displayed in one of its exhibition cases a fragment of a Quran codex with a note of Waqf dated 298, 910, 911, explicitly coming from the Umayyad Great Mosque. Among the material coming from the Qubbat, I was given access in the National Museum. There are a number of fragments, of Quranic fragments, that I'm going to illustrate here, like this one, that is characterized by the presence of a letter, the so-called hairpin kaf, or kaf épingle à cheveux. Let's see, no, it's still here, in its final form. Of this letter, there are two variants are known. You can see here, for example, or here. I don't know if you see, maybe I can. I don't know if you can, no, I cannot highlight in this moment, but in any case, there are a number of these final kaf in this fragment. And as I was saying, there are two variants of this kaf, final kaf are known, a symmetrical one and an asymmetrical one, both of which were in use in the 2nd, 8th century in Quranic manuscripts. Here, it is the asymmetrical variety which is used, a form already employed in pre-Islamic times. For example, in the description of Jabal Usais, in papyri of the 1st century of Hijra, and in Quran manuscript of the following century. This letter form was no longer in use in the 3rd, 9th century, and the long baseline of the letter kaf has been considered to be a decisive element for dating Quranic fragments before the beginning of the 3rd century Hijri AD, 9th century AD. The following fragment we see now illustrates classical Kufi scripts and dates back to the 3rd century, as well as the next one, this one we see here now, that dates back to the 3rd, 4th century Hijri, 9th, 10th century AD. Its graphic type is attested in other finds, such as those of Sana and Qayrawan. The most recent Quranic fragment, which I was able to look at in the National Museum of Damascus, the one we see now, is a good example of one of these graphic varieties that form the so-called new style. The vertical format of the manuscript reflects the spread of the use of paper as writing material, marking the return to the vertical format after 2 centuries, the 3rd and the 4th, in which the oblong format was the common one for Quranic manuscripts. I also had the chance in Damascus to visit the Museum of Calligraphy that is located in the Madrasa Jaqmaqiya, the name of which comes from the name of the Mamluk governor of the city during the years 821, 823 Hijri, AD 1418, 1420, Saifuddin Jaqmaq. The most important evidence I obtained there consists in 3 images of the so-called Quran of Amajur. In this slide, we see 1 folio of the Quran of Amajur that was a multi-volume Quran in Oxford. Because as I said, many of the fragments coming from the Qubbat are nowadays spread and scattered among different institutions in Syria and abroad, and in this case, it's in Oxford. But as I said, fragments from the Qubbat in Damascus can be found in the National Museum and in the Museum of Calligraphy, that are two different places, and possibly also in other places. I'm thinking of the National Library, for example, in Damascus. So this one is in Oxford, and the one in Damascus was exhibited in 2006, is this one. As you can see, there are 3 folios, one on top of the other, but you can recognize quite clearly the Waqf note on the top of the folio. And Ahmed Shaker spoke about this Quran of Amajur in the last meeting, let's say so, of this series. So no need to say more about the Quran of Amajur, but I would like, approaching the end of this talk, I would like to show a couple of block printed amulets that I recently had the chance to study. This comes from the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art in Istanbul. I published them both in the volume I presented you at the very beginning. And these are quite interesting because the block printing technique, which was also employed to realize some portions of the pilgrimage certificates, is attested by a growing number of specimens, the study of which will probably change our still little knowledge of the use of this device in the Islamic culture and regions. I must say, these 2 more new unpublished fragments that are unique because there are no other matching specimens, add to the number of known specimens that is not so big at the moment. There are a little more than 100 and so. But surprisingly, we don't know how many of them, how many block prints there are in Istanbul, for example. There can be hundreds, and in this way, from very rare, this type of, let's say, of technique and of text would become very well known. But at the moment, we cannot say, we cannot yet say much in detail about the quantity. So I hope this interested you, and I'm finished my presentation. I open the floor to questions. I don't know. I give you the...
Yeah, thank you, Arianna, for this useful presentation. I will just give a brief summary in Arabic.
Yes.
And then we will start with questions. طبعا هذا ملخص إذا بالعربية للمحاضرة. دكتورة أريانا تحدثت عن قبة الخزنة أو قبة بيت المال بالجامع الأموي. هذا هناك في هذا الجامع بناء مثمن يحتوي يشبه المستودع، يحتوي هذا المستودع على عدد كبير جدا من المخطوطات والوثائق متعددة اللغات والثقافات. يعني الدكتورة أريانا تحدثت عن مخطوطات شتى، منها يعني شهادات الحج والعمرة، منها أوراق من مصاحف قديمة، نصوص أدبية بالعربية والتركية، ومخطوطات للكتاب المقدس باللغة اليونانية، ولدينا أيضا نصوص فرنسية قديمة ومخطوطات قبطية حتى وأرمينية وسريانية وغيرها من اللغات. وكذلك حتى توجد المخطوطات العربية المكتوبة بالحرف اليوناني. وكذلك يعني لدينا شهادات الحج والعمرة، هذه أيضا ذكرت. فعدد كبير جدا من هذه الوثائق كما ذكرت ريانا ذهبت إلى اسطنبول في عام 1917. ذهبت إلى يعني متحف الأوقاف، ثم هذا متحف الأوقاف صار اسمه متحف الآثار التركية والإسلامية. واليوم في هذا المتحف توجد عدد كبير من هذه الأوراق تسمى بأوراق الشام أو أوراق دمشق، وهو العدد المعلن عنه هو 200,000 يعني رق قرآني، وعدد كبير من المخطوطات القرآنية الموجودة في هذا المتحف. كذلك بيّنت أريانا انتقال عدد من المخطوطات والرقوق إلى عدد من البلدان منها اسطنبول، وكذلك يعني في حالة مصحف أماجور مثلا لدينا عدد كبير من المجموعات التي تحتوي على هذه الأوراق، منها أوكسفورد، منها برلين، منها كامبريدج وغيرها من المكتبات. وكذلك لدي يعني من خلال الزيارة الميدانية لمتحف الوطني بدمشق تعرفت أريانا على عدد من الرقوق التي تعود إلى قبة الخزنة، بينتها لكم في المحاضرة، منها الرقوق القرآنية التي شاهدتموها وهي من القرن الثاني والثالث الهجري، وهناك ورقة أيضا من القرن الخامس كما يبدو، يعني كما رأيناها. وكذلك رقوق أخرى في متحف الخط العربي بدمشق. نعم، فإذا هذه المحاضرة كانت ملخص لما يوجد في قبة الخزنة. وكذلك موضوع قبة الخزنة موضوع الآن محور دراسي علمي يشارك فيه عدد من الباحثين، وصدر بخصوصه كتاب بالإنجليزية حررته أريانا وعدد من الباحثين عن مخطوطات قبة الخزنة، فيه بحوث جديرة بأن تترجم إلى اللغة العربية. وهي يعني العمل على هذه الرقوق مازال يعني مازال الآن يتم العمل عليها ويتم دراستها ونشر نتائج هذه الدراسات للباحثين. هذا كان ملخص سريع لما جاء في هذه المحاضرة. طيب نبدأ بالأسئلة. We'll take questions now. So the first question is, are these manuscripts cataloged and identified and restored? Are they in safe place? And can scholars and researchers access them and see them or not?
It depends. It's a complex question, and it requires a complex answer, in the meaning that most of these fragments are now in Istanbul and at the Museum of the Turkish and Islamic Art, and as long as one can have access to this museum and its holdings, then these materials are available. But myself, I've been there once, but I didn't have the occasion to ask to see these materials. So as far as I know, but it's someone else who told me so, the state of condition of conservation is not perfect, but they are there, so somehow they are preserved in the museum. And this is for Istanbul, but of course there are a number of fragments of which we don't know where they are, if they are still existing, so we cannot give a proper answer. And then finally there are also the fragments in European libraries that are catalogued, but maybe only now we start to know they are linked to the Qubba. So we only know part of the story.
نعم. فإذا الجواب على هذا السؤال هو إنه معظم هذه المخطوطات الآن هي في اسطنبول وفي متحف الآثار التركية والإسلامية ضمن مجموعة أوراق الشام، ولكن طبعا هناك يعني نوع من التعقيد في الوصول لها. هي موجودة هناك، ولكن يعني ربما يحتاج الأمر إلى أذونات خاصة أو طلب خاص حتى يمكن الاطلاع عليها لأنها غير يعني مرقمنة وغير متاحة. ولكن يعني تقول أريانا بالنسبة للمجموعات الأخرى يعني في بعض المكتبات الأخرى يمكن الوصول للمجموعات المرتبطة بقبة الخزنة، يعني من حيث المكتبات الأوروبية التي يكون هناك فيها عدد من هذه المخطوطات، لكن لم يتم التعرف على كل المخطوطات التي تنتمي لقبة الخزنة، يعني البحث ما زال جاريا في هذا المجال. فهذا إذن إجابة السؤال الأول. Okay, so we have a question about the content of the Greek manuscript, the manuscript in Greek letters, the Arabic manuscripts in Greek letters.
Okay.
And are these Islamic or Christian manuscripts?
So there is one famous fragment in Greek script and Arabic language that is the Violet fragment, that is a Christian, contain a Christian text. For the rest, I mean, the remaining fragments in Greek scripts are Bibles or philosophical texts, but these are not in Arabic, are just in Greek script and in Greek language. So the only one very important for Arabists, I would say, is the Greek fragment, that is the Violet fragment, sorry.
إذا تقول إنه معظم المخطوطات التي باليونانية، اللغة اليونانية، هي المخطوطات يعني فلسفية ودينية، يعني الكتاب المقدس، ولكن يوجد مخطوط واحد يعني له أهمية خاصة، وهو يعني قطعة فيوليت، وهو نص يعني عربي لكن مكتوب بحروف يونانية. هذا النص يعني درس، وهذا يعني هو نص مسيحي وليس نصا إسلاميا.
صح.
So he's asking also about the date of this Greek, Arabic and Greek script.
Okay, well, it has been dated to different periods. I would say the most reliable one was the date suggested by Maria Mavrudi, who dated the fragment, but I'm going from memory, to the end of the 9th, beginning of the 10th century AD. But yes, if my memories are good, but I think this is the most reliable date.
إذن تقول إنه التاريخ الأكثر موثوقية هو لأحد لباحثة درست هذه القطعة وأعادتها للفترة من القرن الثامن إلى أوائل القرن العاشر الميلادي. التاسع الميلادي. And so we have also a question on Hebrew manuscripts at Qubbat al-Khazna. Are these being studied or not?
The answer is yes. A survey of all the material in Hebrew has been given by Gideon Boak in the volume just published by Folland, Hirschler, and me. So one can find a survey of all the content of the Hebrew manuscript there.
إذن هناك يعني مسح لهذه المخطوطات العبرية منشور. يعني يمكن الوصول لهذا المحتوى، فهو منشور في دراسة لأحد الباحثين.
I would just add, of course, the survey of the Hebrew manuscript is given on the photos that are available. We don't know if there are other manuscripts somewhere else. So this is always a bit tricky to say everything has been studied or published. We don't know yet in detail how many fragments there are. So for what we can...
So Arianna, where these Hebrew manuscripts are kept, if you know?
We don't know, actually, in the meaning that for the conference in Berlin, we based ourselves on the picture taken by Violette at the beginning of the 20th century, but we don't know the material fragments where they are located. We have pictures of them. We don't have the real thing.
Yes. So Arianna, some materials were transferred to Berlin, right?
Yes.
Around the early 20th century.
Yes, is correct. But then they were sent also back to Damascus or Istanbul, and we lost their trace. No.
But these were photographed, all of them.
Yes. Yes, the material sent to Berlin. We worked on the picture took in Berlin.
Yes. Also, the Ottoman Authority also photographed these before they sent it to Berlin.
Definitely, you're right. But there are various sets of photographs taken in Damascus and in Istanbul as well. Some of the pictures taken in Damascus ended up, but then they were also went lost to Gertrude Bell properties. In Istanbul, there are at least 2 sets of pictures of these fragments, but still we don't know exactly where. So research is going on this.
إذن هي تتحدث عن صور مأخوذة لهذه الرقوق ولهذه المخطوطات، صورها عالم ولاهوتي ألماني اسمه فيوليت في بداية القرن العشرين، يعني عندما سمح له بدراسة محتويات القبة، فصور هذه يعني وصلت هذه المخطوطات إلى برلين، يعني السلطات العثمانية سمحت بإرسالها بعد أن صورتها، وهناك في برلين يعني صورت هذه المخطوطات ثم بعد ذلك أرجعت. فهي تقول يعني بين إرسالها وبين إرجاعها حصل يعني أنه فقدنا الاتصال بهذه المخطوطات ولا نعلم أماكن وجودها الآن يعني بالدقة، ولكن هو توجد الآن صور ويعملون على هذه الصور. هذا بالنسبة للمخطوطات المصورة من قبل يعني فيوليت. So there is a comment here. He said there is a copy of Ihya Ulum al-Din by al-Ghazali. In this, I don't know if this is a question or an information. So he said there is a copy authored by al-Ghazali, an autograph, I presume.
Okay.
Yes, I have no idea.
Thank you.
Yes. Do you have any idea about Arabic manuscripts, like certain titles?
Not really. At the moment, still the path of research concerning the move of the volumes from the Qubbat to the public library in Damascus is a very interesting one. At the moment, I mean, in the last few years, it was very difficult to have access to Syria, I mean, to travel, and at least, and I don't think that was possible to make any inquiry on this. Maybe in the future.
Yes. Arianna, I noticed also you mentioned a botanical text.
Yes, yes.
Can you tell us more about this? Is it, are these surviving folios, or is it a complete work?
No, we have just a couple of fragments, 2 fragments, and we have just the pictures, not the actual fragment. And we had these pictures because it is a palimpsest. So it was documented again at the beginning of the 20th century by a biblical scholar who was interested in the scriptio inferior, who didn't care, I would say, about the Arabic, but it is useful because we can still have the Arabic text through this picture made for biblical studies. And this botanical medical text by Ibn Habib has been studied and presented recently in a conference by the students of mine, as I said, and it was identified, the text, as this Mukhtasar fi Tib, donc an abridgment on of medical content, of which there is only one entire manuscript copy. I mean, it has been edited, the text, on the basis of a unique manuscript preserved in Rabat. But these fragments, I mean, the photos of these fragments attest a much older tradition of this very same text, so are quite interesting, but unlikely are very short.
إذا كنا نتحدث عن مخطوط ذكرته في المحاضرة، مخطوط يعني طبي نباتي، هو عبارة عن طرس، النص الفوقي ونص عربي، والنص التحتي الذي هو أثار اهتمام أحد اللاهوتيين هو نص من الكتاب المقدس. Arianna, how many palimpsests are there in this, to your knowledge? How many palimpsests are in this Qubbat al-Khazna? We have seen several palimpsests. I even recall seeing a Quranic palimpsest. Of course, we don't know where it went, but I think this was published in 1906 from just a photograph. I have seen it as a photograph, and this was one of the very rare Quranic
I think so.
Yes.
But I mean, it is difficult to give a precise figure. I would say a few hundred, something that goes in this way. I mean, some hundreds of palimpsests. I mean, mostly Greek, but not only Greek, but also Syriac as scripture inferior and Arabic as scripture superior. I would say so. But it is difficult, again, to give a precise number, precise figure. Yeah.
Yes. إذا نتحدث عن يعني عدد الطروس الموجودة في المجموعة، فتقول يعني يصعب إحصاء هذا العدد كليا، لكن كما رأينا في المحاضرة يوجد عدد من هذه الطروس يعني بالنص العربي أو النص اليوناني وغيرها من اللغات. So here's a question about official documents, administrative documents. Are there administrative documents being found in the Qubbat al-Khazna?
I mean, I would say yes. This is probably the part that I know a bit less, but for sure, apart, for example, I mean, there are official documents of religious nature, like the certificate of pilgrimage, but there are also other documents pertaining to other, I mean, to legal questions. So yes, there are also some of them have been published, and so I would say yes.
Are you referring also to the Ottoman period, like documents?
No, and yes, there can be also something, let's say, more recent documents, but I remind also other things. But I must check to give you a proper answer, because the bibliography is quite vast. So we deal with so many different things, from let's say block prints to Quranic manuscript, going in between all these palimpsests, and then there are documents too, and religious documents and official documents. So one needs to deal with a vast number of publications. So this is the reason why I'm so cautious in giving this answer, because I'm going on just on my memory.
Yes. إذن هي تقول يعني عدد الوثائق كبير جدا، ولكن يعني هي أيضا تقول أنه توجد وثائق يعني ذات طابع ديني وذات طابع إداري يعني في قبة الخزنة. So here's a question. Do you think Qubbat al-Khazna is quite similar to the Cairo Geniza that has Jewish writings?
So the question is a very good question. Of course, there are a lot of points in common. For the Qubbat al-Khazna was employed the expression Genitsa-like deposits, in the meaning that they have really a number of points in common, but there are also some differences between the two types of deposit, but clearly it is interesting to look at this phenomenon in parallel. So it's a very good point. And actually, all in this recent volume, the point was made to balance somehow the presence of the Genitsa documents with also the Qubbat al-Khazna documents, in the meaning that there are two sides of a world, of a period, of a vast period of time that are witnessed by different handwritten material. So yes, there are a lot of things in common, but of course there are also differences between the two.
Okay. إذا تقول يعني هناك أشياء متشابهة بين القبة الخزنة والجنيزة اليهودية، يعني من حيث أن هي يعني هناك أنهم يشتركان في أنهم يعني مستودع للمخطوطات والأوراق، ولكن هناك بلا شك اختلافات بينهما. ولكن يعني تقول يمكن قراءة القبة والجنيزة يعني بالتوازي، وهذا ما فعله عدد من الباحثين في الكتاب الذي حررته هي حول مخطوطات قبة الخزنة، فهي تشير أيضا إلى الدراسات الموجودة في هذا الكتاب. So Arianna, the Cairo Geniza is mostly, it's not a multilingual, multicultural, like a phenomena, not a multicultural.
Well,
what's the difference, the similarities and differences between the Qubba and the Cairo Geniza in terms of content, in terms of different cultures, religions, and languages?
This is a complex question. Of course, in the Cairo Geniza, we have mirrored both the Judeo, but also the Judeo-Arabic culture. So somehow also the Arabic language is mirrored in the Geniza, in the Cairo Geniza. And in any case, the documents in the Cairo Geniza give us back a wide image of the huge, I would say, Islamic world. This is for sure. On the contrary, why this is better? The Qubbat al-Khazna has its own peculiarities, in the meaning that, as you were pointing out, the number of the scripts attested, the number of the languages attested that goes or don't go with the script is a main point of difference that qualifies the Qubbat al-Khazna in a proper and specific way. But also, I would say somehow the purpose of the two deposits can be very different. For the Geniza, we can think about, I would say, a religious deposit, whilst for the Qubbat, somehow we know this was suggested by Hirschler in a very interesting way, that this material was actually reused for binding again, for restoring manuscripts. So the use of the deposit also has a different concept behind. But they both share, for example, the somehow a location very specific. I mean, a place that there is not accessible by everyone, even if then we know that yet the Qubbat was opened and fragments were taken and reused in other manuscripts, whilst in principle in the Geniza, documents were deposited to be stored and put away from other, let's say, as sort of preservation. So this is a very salient point of difference between the two, I would say.
Yes. إذن هي تتحدث عن التماثلات والاختلافات بين قبة الخزنة كمستودع لحفظ للمخطوطات متعددة اللغات والثقافات، يعني كما رأينا عدد كبير من المخطوطات، في حين أنه مخطوطات الجنيزة يعني هي مكان لا يطلع عليه كل الناس، وهو مكان لحفظ الأوراق. يعني هو يعرفنا عن يعني عن الثقافة اليهودية والثقافة، يعني باعتبار أنه هذه المخطوطات مكتوبة بالخط بالعبرية لكن بالخط العربي. نعم، باعتبار أنه هي الجنيزة أماكن لحفظ المخطوطات المقدسة كما ذكر الأستاذ أحمد، التي تحمل إنه اسم الله عز وجل، يعني تكون يعني لها مكانة خاصة، في حين أن قبة الخزنة يعني ليست بها عدد كبير ليست لها هذه الخصوصية التي للجنيزة. هذه هي النقطة الفارقة، أنه الجنيزة لها خصوصية، قبة الخزنة لا، ليست لها نفس هذه الخصوصية، لأنه كما رأينا في عدد كبير من المخطوطات والأوراق وتعبر عن ثقافات مختلفة. لكن هناك أسئلة لا تظهر لي الآن. إذن هل هناك أسئلة أخرى؟ أظن كان هناك سؤال عن المخطوطات القرآنية، ولكن يعني لا أستطيع أن أرى السؤال الآن. So there's a question about, he's asking you if you have seen official documents or correspondences in the Qubba, like if you have seen it yourself, and do you think, and is it accessible to scholars or not?
So, as far as I'm concerned, I had only access to the Qubba material in Damascus, and there I was only given, I would say, Quranic fragments coming from the Qubba. Possibly, I mean, there are such documents in Istanbul, but I've never done any research myself in person in Istanbul. So I cannot give you a first-hand answer on this.
إذن هي تقول يعني هي درست المخطوطات الموجودة في يعني بشكل شخصي بشكل مباشر، كانت الموجودة في المتحف الوطني بدمشق، يعني أكثرها مخطوطات قرآنية، وتلك التي كانت في موجودة الآن في متحف الخط أيضا بدمشق. يعني هذه كزيارة ميدانية قامت بها في من عدة سنوات. We have so many questions, which is very good. Okay, we have a question about script and paleography in Quranic manuscripts found at Qubbat al-Khazna. He's asking about the development of our knowledge of these manuscripts.
Again, it's a beautiful question. It's a very interesting one. Let's say through the fragments and manuscripts, but also through other, not just fragments and not just, I would say, volumes books in a volume form, but also through rolls, for example. We had a lot of interesting material to study of course, the development of the Arabic script, especially in Masahif, in Quran. We have advanced a lot in the last, I would say, 20 years, 30 years, but still there are a lot of aspect that needs to be detailed and better understood. In next June, I will give a talk, and I will dedicate a talk to, for example, the roles, the Quran in roll forms that are a very peculiar form of Quran, and that can be explained, in my opinion, very well in a Syrian context in Damascus in a certain epoch, because of the cultural context. But then this is the, I would say, the topic of another talk. But in any case, for sure, through the Damascus fragment, through the Quranic fragment from the Qubba, we were able, because I would say some of them were dated or datable. I'm thinking to the Quran of Amajur, for example, but also to the other Waqfiyya in the Damascus National Museum that give us a date. So we can have very somehow reliable dated fragments on which we can refer to date undated fragments. So yes, it's an important thing.
إذن تقول هو يعني سؤال مهم جدا، وبالفعل يعني هذه المخطوطات القرآنية أضافت لمعرفتنا، ويعني منها مثلا الوقفية، وقفية مصحف أماجور، يعني هذا المصحف المكتوب عليه تاريخ الوقف، هذا كان مساعدا لنا لمعرفة تاريخ هذا المصحف. يعني هذا من الأشياء التي أفادتنا بها قبة الخزنة، إنه أعطتنا تاريخ لمصحف يعني يعتبر من المصاحف القليلة التي يعني أمكن تاريخها من خلال الرجوع لنص الوقفية. هذا من الأشياء طبعا التي أفادتنا بها قبة الخزنة. وكذلك تتحدث أريانا عن اللفائف، يعني الرولز، اللفائف القرآنية، وهي ظاهرة يعني رأيناها في مخطوطات في قبة الخزنة. هذه اللفائف يعني معروضة اليوم في المتحف، متحف الآثار التركية. وجدت يعني يمكن رؤية هذه اللفائف معروضة. I have seen those rolls you mentioned.
Yes, but they have a different inventory number from the how you say, the Damascus papers. So they come from the Qubba, but they are not. They have in the number of the fragments we are mentioned as Damascus papers. But yeah, they come from the Qubba, and they are amazing. They are very interesting.
Amazing, yes, which is very unique for to see the Quran in this rolls.
Yes.
In contrast to the codex.
And this, I will try to offer an answer to this kind of a book form for Qurans in the next
You're giving a talk about this.
Yes.
إذا نتحدث عن اللفائف القرآنية، لا قرآنية، وهي يعني موضوع مهم، وهي ستقدم حول هذا الموضوع محاضرة يعني لفهم هذه اللفائف وطريقة صناعتها، لأن هي طبعا تعتبر حالة نادرة إنه إحنا لدينا لفائف قرآنية على عكس يعني المصاحف اللي هي الكتاب. يعني اللفائف هي شيء يلف يعني على عكس نظام الكتاب. هو الكتاب مكون من ملازم، هذه الملازم طبعا تخيط وتطوى وإلى آخر ذلك. اللفائف يعني لها نظام مختلف. هذا إذن موضوع جدير بالبحث.
أي صح.
I'll just see if we have more questions. There is a question about if we can locate these manuscripts on a Damascus map. Can we locate, like geographically, these manuscripts? That maybe I will give an example, a case study, maybe that for example, the image of Quran that was probably produced in city of Tyre. That
exactly. I mean, yes.
Damascus. That how can we explain this? And
but this is not just the case of the Quran of Amajur. There are also a number of Jewish Hebrew fragments coming from Tyre, and let's say from a geographical point of view, for what we know, again, this has to be stressed, for what we know, the Qubbat materials come from, let's say, Bilad al-Sham. This is probably the most logical and also the most likely provenance of most of the fragments. But we cannot avoid to mention, for example, as the Coptic manuscript attest, also that they were in this case for the Coptic fragments, they attest a Coptic community outside Egypt, but there are also traveling witnesses. These are called traveling witnesses coming from North Africa, somehow linked to also to North African communities in Damascus. And it is difficult to know at that point if they were coming from North Africa or they were produced by the North African people in Damascus. But yeah, there are traveling also fragments that comes from abroad, from regions that are beyond the Bilad al-Sham, but in a lesser extent. Usually, I would say this material is considered primarily Syrian, Damascene.
إذا نتحدث عن مصدر هذه الأوراق والرقوق الموجودة في قبة الخزنة. يعني من الواضح أنه كثير من هذه المخطوطات يعني مصدرها بلاد الشام، ولكن توجد مخطوطات يعني تسميها أريانا شواهد متنقلة، يعني مثل المخطوطات القبطية. يعني هذا مسألة الوجود مجتمعات قبطية ومخطوطات قبطية خارج مصر نجدها في قبة الخزنة. فهذا يعني إنه Arianna, you mean these were transferred? These were the Coptic fragments, for example.
Let's say there are some fragments that attest, yes, let's say Copt outside Egypt for sure. So someone has to brought them there.
Someone who probably lived there. that we don't know.
Nah.
So basically you're saying it's very unique to find a Coptic text in Damascus, outside Egypt.
Outside Egypt. This is, I'm not a specialist of Coptic, but as Alin Sushu, who was the author of this, the study of the Coptic material from the Qubbat, stressed, if I remember well, of course, is that it's quite exceptional to find Coptic fragments outside Egypt. So Coptic, say, manuscript witnesses outside Egypt. So yes, it's...
نعم، إذا تقول من الصعب يعني أن نجد مخطوطات قبطية خارج مصر، ففي هذه الحالة قبة الخزنة تعتبر يعني مثالا نادرا، لأنه يعني وجد فيها مخطوط قبطي. فهذا يعني أنه خارج مصر. هذا من الفوائد التي أو من الفوائد القيمة لقبة الخزنة، أنها تحتوي على مخطوط قبطي، يعني مما يساعد الباحثين على إجراء مزيد من الدراسات حول هذا الموضوع، حول يعني ربما المجتمعات القبطية التي عاشت خارج مصر أيضا.
But there are also, for example, fragments in Maghrebi script from the western part of the Dar al-Islam. So also in this case, we are saying that there are traveling manuscripts.
إذا نحن نتحدث عن شواهد متنقلة، يعني تقول يوجد أيضا مخطوطات مغربية يعني من شمال أفريقيا وجدت في قبة الخزنة. فهذا من الأمثلة على انتقال المخطوطات، وهو أمر يعني أمر مشاهد كثيرا في مجموعات المخطوطات، أن نجد مخطوط من مكان أو أنتج في مكان معين ثم انتقل إلى عدة مجموعات تاريخيا، ثم استقر به الأمر إلى مكان يعني مثل قبة الخزنة أو الجامع العتيق بمصر أو الجامع الأموي أو كثير من الجوامع، يعني حتى لأسباب تكون أحيانا لحماية المخطوط، يكون هناك أسباب نزاع أو حرب أو كذا، فينقل المخطوط إلى مكان آخر، مكان أكثر أمنا. هذا يعني من جهة معينة.
But yet, I mean, if I may say something, what is still to be understood is why all these fragments in different languages were gathered inside the Umayyad Mosque, because of course Christian texts in Armenian or in Syriac, why they ended up in the Qubbat al-Khazna, this is still a question that needs further research.
إذن يعني مسألة احتواء قبة الخزنة على هذا العدد الكبير والمختلف من المخطوطات مازال هذا السؤال يحتاج إلى إجابة، إنه كيف تضمنت هذه القبة هذا الكم المختلف من الثقافات واللغات والكتب التي تعبر عن ثقافات مختلفة وأديان مختلفة. يعني انتهى بها الأمر إلى هذا المستودع في الجامع الأموي. فهذا هو السؤال الذي مازال الباحثون يشتغلون عليه. Okay, so we have a question about Quranic rolls. He says, I have seen it myself, and they are complete in terms of surahs, but they do not have the first surahs. And he's asking if you know why they don't have the first surahs of the Quran, or actually why they only have the first surahs of the Quran.
They only have the first surahs of the Quran. Well, it depends. I mean, clearly, on one hand, one has to. There are more or less complete roles with the Quranic text. Clearly, somehow it's a technical matter. So longer is the roll, more fragile is. But also sometimes there is the whole Quran recorded on them. It depends on the script. So it depends also on the epoch we are speaking about. I mean, when they were produced, but the old ones at least are quite complete.
إذا تقول لا، يعني يوجد أيضا لفائف فيها يعني كاملة، وهذا يعتمد على طبيعة اللفافة نفسها وما تحتويه من نص قرآني يعني.
I must say, I didn't have the occasion to have them in my hand because these are in Istanbul. So I don't have first-hand knowledge of this material. I've just read the literature about them. I hope one day to be able to go and see them, so to be sure of the exact content of the text in these rolls.
أوكي. يعني هي تقول أنها لم تحظى بفرصة للاطلاع المباشر على هذه اللفائف، يعني حتى تدرسها بشكل مستفيض وتصل إلى يعني نتيجة أو خلاصة حول ذلك، لكن هي تنوي القيام بذلك أيضا في المستقبل. Okay, so we also have a question on the Quranic rolls. To which period it dates?
Well, this is again a tricky question in the meaning that they are quite I mean, it is not my study, it is the study of a French scholar, Solange Horry. She says that there are early rolls. So I would say from the end of the Umayyad, beginning of the Abbasid period, more or less, at least the one in Istanbul Horry studied. This is, she doesn't give a specific date, but she said early Quranic rolls. So
yes. There is also an interesting account about Quranic rolls. I find it in an epistle attributed to Abd al-Masih al-Kindi.
Mm-hmm.
In that epistle, he mentioned that it's, of course, a polemical one, mm-hmm. But he says that Muslims used Quranic rolls mm-hmm. In the time of Khalifa Uthman.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I can't recall the text exactly now, but he said that he mentioned the Quranic rolls, that they use it, and they took it. He said they took it from the Jews, the Jewish people, and which is in a polemical text, of course. Do you think this is? I think this is from. I can't recall the date of this epistle, but maybe the 8th or 9th century.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. But the point is that the roll is a very old, one of the first book form ever existed. But then one has to pay attention to the form and the use of this book form, because, for example, the Torah has different, I would say, way of opening than compared to the Quran, for example. I mean, the one survived. We don't know about how were the rolls who were in use before the one we know, because they don't exist. So according to the material evidence, we can say that these are similar but not the same. The idea of rolling is the same, but the actual book form is different. So it's a very interesting topic to me, and it needs more research. This is the reason why I started to collect data and ideas about this material, especially from the Qubbat, because they allow, I mean, speaking about rolls, allow to enlarge the research to a number of questions of who was making the tradition linked to the use of these rolls, so it's very interesting topic. I will be happy one day to speak with you.
That would be very interesting talk about Quranic roles. It's very unique, and we need to know more about how they use it, and for what purposes they would use a Quranic role. Okay, so let's take some last questions before we end this great discussion with Professor Arianna. So he says, Damascus was the third capital in Islam, especially in the Umayyad era. So it is understood to get all collections in the mosque and libraries centers, and many manuscripts very acceptable to be transferred to Damascus. So why did Professor suppose it is a Coptic community in Damascus? What evidence would suggest this against the general idea? If you want to clarify this point, Arianna.
Well, I would not know to. I would say to go on this Coptic material, but again, I maintain I'm going on my memories, but this was something that the specialist of this Coptic fragment stressed in his paper. So I suggest the person interested on this specific point that I remember. I'm pretty sure in this way that is quite unique to find Coptic fragments from Coptic texts outside Egypt. This is what I remember, but I suggest him or her to refer to Alin Suchu study to be sure of what he said, because again, I dealt mainly with Arabic and Quranic things, not with Coptic.
يعني هي تقول إنه هذا مجال المخطوطات القبطية هناك دراسة أجريت عنها، فيمكن للباحث المهتم الرجوع إليها ومعرفة الحجج المذكورة حول المصدر المخطوطات القبطية التي وجدت في قبة الخزنة، لأنه هذا يعني ليس مجال تخصصها الرئيسي، بل هو يعني ذكر عرضا في هذا النقاش يعني. ولكن المقصود أن هناك دراسات أجريت في هذا المجال حول المخطوطات القبطية من قبة الخزنة.
اسم الباحث هو آلين سوترو. This is the name of the researcher.
نعم هذا اسم الباحث. ربما نكتبه لاحقا، يعني ربما أيضا نضع بعض المصادر، لأنه تأتيني بعض الأسئلة حول المصادر المتوفرة لدراسة قبة. References and books about قبة الخزنة. Maybe we'll put this later. I think we'll finish for this fruitful discussion. We enjoyed your presentation. We enjoyed this live discussion with you. We look forward to have you again with this series of lectures on early Islamic and Quranic documents. Thank you so much, Professor Arianna.
Thank you
for being here with us, and thank you so much for listening. And we shall see you soon.
Thank you again.
إذا نلقاكم إن شاء الله في لقاء آخر ضمن هذه المبادرة المخصصة للباحثين المشتغلين على الوثائق الإسلامية والقرآنية المبكرة، التي يمكن أيضا للمهتمين الانضمام لها. يعني هناك روابط تجدونها في الصفحة. وشكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.